In this video, we'll orchestrate a workflow relying 100% on a serverless approach based on Azure Functions. And bonus, we'll do this with a real-life example. You don't want to miss this, so stay tuned. Hey there and welcome to the Code Wrinkles channel. In a previous video, we have talked about Azure Functions and we have looked into how we can leverage the power of serverless to create a REST API only based on Azure Functions. And Azure Functions are really cool. However, when you start to work with them in real applications, you will soon realize that they also have a major drawback. And that drawback is that stateful coordination requirements are really cumbersome to implement. Believe me, this is not an edge case. Actually, this is fairly common. Because when we want to use Azure Functions, we just want to execute some pieces of functionality. But more often than not, those pieces of functionality need actually to know what happened before them and what will happen maybe after their execution. So using the standard Azure Functions would be pretty cumbersome to implement this stateful coordination. Thankfully, we also have Azure Durable Functions. And their primary use case is to simplify complex stateful coordination. And there are quite a few workflow patterns that could benefit from Azure Durable Function. First of all, it's a pattern that we would call function chaining. And in this pattern, we will have the output of each function being or serving as the input for the next function. So we essentially chain those functions together. Another very important pattern is the fan out and the fan in. Now, in this pattern, what happens is that we usually want to run several different functions in parallel, and then when they all complete, we want to run some aggregation based on the results that each of the functions gave us. Then also the problem of human interaction in automated process is something that can be simplified with Azure Durable Function. The challenge here is that humans are usually not that responsive as regular Azure functions, and that's obvious and it's normal. And then we need a way to understand exactly when a human interacts with the automated workflow so that we can continue our automated workflow from that exact human interaction. There are a few other patterns out there, but these are the most commonly used from my point of view. I know these patterns might seem a little bit too theoretical and probably also abstract to you. And that's why in this video I want to take a look at a real life scenario, a real life workflow that we want to implement using Azure Durable Functions. So we'll want to implement a notify support workflow. And this workflow is actually very simple, but it will be very powerful to allow us to understand exactly how durable functions work. So the input for our workflow is obviously a user going into a web application and creating a support request. Now the next step of the workflow once the support request is created is we need to get from a data store. In our case, we will have an SQL database. We will have to get the appropriate support contacts based on the support type that was selected. Now, once we get those support contacts, we start with the first contact in the list and we want to send an email to that specific contact. And we also want to give, in this case, just a time frame of 1 minute in which that specific person that received that email should also go to our web application and on a dedicated page should just take ownership of that specific support request. Now, if this doesn't happen inside 1 minute, what it happens that in our workflow, it will simply go to the next support contact in the list and it will send once again an email. And then everything starts from scratch. Now we are waiting 1 minute and to see if that second person would be able to accept ownership. And if not, we will send another email and so on and so forth. And if we arrive at the end of the support contact list, then what we'll do here, if nobody has taken ownership, in our case, we'll just start with the list from scratch and we'll send another email to the first one in the list. Now, obviously, within all this circuit, when somebody accepts the ownership of that request, that kind of like marks the end of the workflow, because in that point or at that point we know exactly that somebody took ownership of that specific support request. Let's start by understanding the entire solution that we have here. So first of all, we have here this weather forecast app, which is a Blazor server application. And this is the regular Blazor server application with the regular template. However, there is a catch to it, because we have added two pieces of functionality. So if we take a look at those pages here, we see that we have once this notify support, and this notify support component is where a user will kickstart the entire notify support workflow or process. And it's just a very easy form in which the user needs to specify a title, a description, and it needs to also select a specific support type. Now, the other functionality that we have added is this ownership. And this ownership means that here a support contact that needs or wants to accept the ownership of a certain support request, it needs to come here to this page, and they will be able to have this very simple form. They will have to specify the instance ID for the support request, and we'll see exactly how this plays out with all the other components just a little bit later, and then just submit. And that will submit or notify our entire workflow that, hey, a user or a support contact has accepted ownership of that specific support request. And that's basically all the functionality that we have added here in our Blazor server application. We also have here a persistence layer, and this persistence layer is a very simple one. We have this support DB context in which we also have some data seeding. So if you're getting the source code, the only thing that you would need to do is to just update the database, provide a connection string, and you will have all the information in your database to really get started with this specific implementation for this workflow. And last but not least, we have our Azure Durable Function, which is a durable function project in which we have this notify support orchestrator, which is the entire orchestrator for our entire workflow. And here what we do is we have this startup class because we want to use entity framework and the DB context and register it to the dependency injection container, just like we do in a regular ASP.NET Core application. And that helps us if we go to this notify support orchestrator. It will help us because we can then dependency inject it in the constructor of our durable function. As you see, there's quite a little bit of code there, and it might even seem a little bit complex at certain points. That's why I think that you might want to also access the source code. And what I usually do is that I always share the source code for every video with the CodeWrinkles ambassador members and higher. So if you want to get access to the source code, you will find just below this video a button join, and then you can join the CodeWrinkles membership as an ambassador. And on the memberships tab on the channel that will appear to you in that case, you will find the exact instructions on how you can access this source code. Now, if we take a better look at what we have here, I have prepared here two different regions. And I have called these regions orchestrator and activities, and then I have another region which is called client functions. And this introduces a very important concept in Azure Durable Functions because we have different functions types. So first of all, we have the orchestrator function, and as the name implies, the orchestrator is responsible to orchestrate the entire workflow. Then we have what we call client functions. Client functions are not part of the workflow, but are interacting with the orchestrator in or through different scenarios. And two very common use cases for which we use client functions in such orchestrations is to trigger the entire workflow or to raise external events to the workflow so that the workflow becomes aware of those events and maybe implements a certain orchestration logic based on that specific event. And then we also have activity function, which are the basic working unit in an Azure Durable Function context. And the orchestrator usually orchestrates such activity functions. Coming back to our solution here, I want to expand this client functions region, and we have for this entire workflow two different client functions. And one of these client functions is the entry point. So basically this is an HTTP trigger, and what we do is from the Blazor application, when we click on submit request, it will make a post request to this trigger, so this function will be executed, and this will act as a trigger for the entire orchestration. And we can see this because what we do here, first of all, we read the body, the content of the HTTP request, and from that content we extract some information. That information is needed because we need to know exactly the title of the support request, the description, and most importantly, what type of support request that is, because that would be a vital piece of information. And then what we do here is we use this starter, which is an iDurable orchestration client, and here we have this start new async. And in this start new async, we specify the name of our durable function orchestrator, and we specify here, for instance, null for the instance ID, because right now we don't know the instance ID. The instance ID gets created as a result of the start new async. And then we also specify the trigger info that we have read from the body or from the content of the initial HTTP request, and we will pass this as an input to our orchestrator function. And then what we do here is we just return create check status response and then the request and then instance ID. And when we'll run the demo and we'll go through the entire process, we'll see that this is actually a vital piece of information, because the response that we get here will give us a lot of information about the ongoing workflow, the status of the workflow, and a lot of other types of information or interactions that we could have with that specific workflow or with that specific orchestration function. The next client function that we have, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the use case is that we want to kind of like communicate to the orchestration context or to the orchestrator exactly if there are some external events that might be important for that specific use case. And in our case, we have such an external event, because when a support contact goes to the web application and he or she would click on the accept ownership button, we need to notify, or we need to let the orchestrator know that somebody accepted that specific request. So in this client function, what we do, once again, we get the body, because from the body we will get the instance ID. And the instance ID is very important, because you can imagine there might be different users that will create a support request, let's say maybe in 1 or 2 seconds or 1 minute. So we would have 2 different instances running probably, or more instances running. And that's why when we do this event, or when we raise this event, we need to specify the instance ID so that the orchestration knows exactly to what specific instance of the orchestrator this event is related to. And that's why we get this from the body, and then on the durable client, like this iDurable client, we just call this raise event async. We specify the instance ID and the name of the event. And then we just return to the client this accepted result. Let's move over to the next region. And here we have, first of all, the orchestrator, which is once again the function that orchestrates our entire workflow. And then we also have some different activity functions. So let me walk you through all what's happening here. Now, when we get a trigger, or when that client function will trigger or will start this specific orchestration, first of all, we specify a list of outputs. In our case, we just will use strings so that we play some information about the steps that happened in our workflow. And then the next step is we need a way to get the input from the trigger that we received. And always when we have client functions that needs to communicate with the orchestrator, that communication goes always through this get input or through input. So on the context, we can call get input, and we know that the trigger function has used this notify support trigger info, so we want to get that info. Now we have all the information about the support request, and that's the step where we can actually go and execute our first activity function. So if we go to this activity function, as we see, we return a list of support contact, but we also need an input. And as always said, communication of inputs and outputs between the orchestration or the orchestrator and other activity functions or functions in general, they will happen through the context. And when we call this a specific activity from the orchestration, we also specify the support contact as an input. So what we do here is we get it here. Now, why do we need this information? Because based on the information, we want from the database to get only the support contacts that match for the contact type of the support request, and then we simply just return the list of it. So by the time this activity completes, it means that we will have here an entire list of support contacts, and that's actually what we want. And we also add to the output some information that found the appropriate support contacts. And here is the next place in our workflow, or the next step in the workflow, in which we need to perform some actions. Like for instance, we need to send an email, but then we also need to listen or to see if somebody takes the ownership, because if somebody takes ownership, we need to kind of like finalize the workflow. So what we do here is we create a cancellation token. Now the thing here is that we want to keep track when we have an owner. So that's why we have this pool waiting owner, and we set this to true. Now the next thing that we do here is we need to keep a little bit of track about who we have sent an email and who we want to send an email next if nobody took ownership. So that's why we have these 2 integer variables here. And then we have this while loop. And in this loop, what we do here, obviously, first of all, we want to send the email. And when we send an email, what we do, we call another activity function. So if we navigate here, we see that here we use SendGrid, and we have all the packages installed for SendGrid. So what it would happen is that I will read the SendGrid API key from my environment variables, then I will construct a message with a from, with a to, with a subject like the need support request, and then the plain text, please go to the support app and take ownership ASAP. And then we are waiting for ownership. And here is where the fun part starts. Because right now we have sent an email, but what we need to do in our orchestration is to kind of like listen and understand if anybody accepted the ownership. And if not, then we have to resend an email to the next support contact. But if yes, then we have to finalize the workflow. So the first thing that we need to do here is we will need to set up two different tasks. And there will be a task for waiting for the event to happen or waiting for the event to be received. And then we will also have to set up a task that would be kind of like a timer. And to create this timer, obviously we need some information about the current date and time. And I want us to draw attention here on this because we are not using datetime now. We are using from the context current UTC date time and add minutes 1. This is a vital concept, and believe me, it caused me a lot of headaches, and that's why I wanted to spare all the headaches that I had. So we really need to take a look into this. Orchestration functions need to be deterministic. So this means that given an input, they will always give the same output, going to the same sequence of different states. This means in turn that we cannot introduce elements of randomness in our orchestration functions. And for instance, we cannot use GUID new GUID, or we cannot use datetime now, or anything that implements or that has a certain degree of randomness into it. Another very important thing that needs to be avoided at all costs when we have Azure Durable Functions and orchestrators are infinite loops. Azure Durable Functions have behind a so-called history table, and they use that history table to keep track of all the different state changes that the entire process goes through. Now you can imagine that if a function, for instance, gets idle, if we are waiting for an input or for a certain event to happen, when the function starts again, based on that history table, an Azure Durable Function recalculates the state of the current function. Now you have to imagine if we have an infinite loop, that history table will become very, very big. And this in turn would mean that the startup time for a function will grow and grow. And obviously, at a certain point, we might even run out of memory, and running out of memory in an Azure Durable Function is a dedicated headache on itself. Now that we have this out of the way, we can concentrate on what needs to be done next. So we need to create two different tasks. One timeout task that should wait for 1 minute because we have specified here this expiration, and one other task that will wait for this owner found event to happen. And we have looked a little bit earlier in the client function that raises this event. So here is the orchestration and how we consume the event. Now the idea is that we want to run these tasks, and when any of the tasks complete, then we need to understand who is the winner. So which task basically completed first. If the ownership accept task has completed first, it means that somebody has accepted the ownership. So in that case, what we will do, we will set this waiting owner to false so that we will exit this while loop. We'll also add some output, and we'll also cancel the task or the timer task if it is still running. If this is not true, it means that the timeout task has completed the first one and we haven't got any event. So in that case, we just write to the output that owner not found, trying another support contact. And since we are in a while loop and this waiting owner is still true, it means that we will go through this entire process from scratch. And at a certain point, I would assume that the winner task or that the winner task will actually be this ownership accept task. And in that case, it means that, yeah, okay, we have done everything, we cancel everything. It means that we will also go out of the loop, and then we just will return the outputs and the workflow is completed. So let's run now the entire setup and go through the entire workflow. First of all, we can see here all the functions that we have, and we see that we have this accept ownership, which is based on HTTP trigger. This is a client function. The entry point is also based on HTTP trigger. This is also a client function. And then you see that the orchestrator and all the other activity functions are also colored here with different colors. So it's easier for us to understand exactly that these functions are a little bit different than these ones. And then we also have this Blazor application. And as said, here we have this contact support. And this is the part where a user can contact support. So let's fill in a title. I will just give here some dummy things. And the most important thing that we need to choose here is this support type. Let's choose technical and let's click on submit. And right now it will submit a request to our input client function that will take the request and will initiate and start the entire orchestration process. Now you remember that from that function we actually return something, and what we return I actually display here in this text area. And this is actually very important because you can use this information or use this information throughout your entire application to understand when an activity started, if it is still running, if it is completed, what the outputs were, and so on and so forth. But basically what we have here are two things that are very important. Now the first thing, we have here this status query get URI, which is a URI that we can basically use to check the status of the current instance. So if we just run a get, we see here some information. First of all, we see the name, we see the instance ID, and we see the status. And we see that the status is running, and we also see the initial input that we had. Now, as you'll see here, there are several other URIs that are exposed. For instance, if you want to send an event, if you want to cancel the task, if you want to terminate, if you want to resum. Now, the other thing that is very important here is this instance ID. And I will for now copy this instance ID. Let's also take a look at what happens in the background. And we see that our functions are continuously executed. The entire process has started and it kind of like sends email continuously to all the contacts and waits to see if somebody accepts ownership or not. Now let's move over and let's say that I have received my email at a certain point. So I want to go here to the ownership and I want to kind of like accept this one. So I will use the instance ID and I will click here on accept. So let's go back and understand exactly what happens here. And I think the workflow has ended, and the best way that we can check this is to go here back to our URL and just refresh it. And now if we take a look, it is completed. So you can see here that then we have the entire output here. That's it. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the thumbs up button and like this video so that others might discover it easier. And if you are for the first time on the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so that you are always notified when there is something new happening here. If you have any question or just want to get in touch with me, don't be shy and head over to the comment section and just leave me a comment and I would be more than happy to get in touch with you. This being said, thank you very much for watching, and until the next time, I wish you the very best.